Hello, hello. It's the Japan Zoominar at UC San Diego on June 29th, 2021, which is June 30th, 2021 in Japan. Ohayo gozaimasu. I'm Ulrike Schade, professor of Japanese business at UC San Diego and director of JFIT. JFIT is at the School of Global Policy and Strategy, GPS. We are an international relations and public policy school. And one of our offerings is a Master's of International Affairs with a Japan specialization. If our offerings sound of interest, go to our website. It's at gps.ucsd.edu. And at GPS, we have JFIT, our little Japan center. If you'd like to know more about JFIT, go to jfit.ucsd.edu. If you go there, you can find a tab called News and Media, where you can sign up for our bi-weekly San Diego, Japan newsflash, the unnews from Japan and San Diego. It's about just keeping you updated of what we think are interesting stories that you won't read in the normal news. And right next to that tab is the Japan Zoominars tab, where you can sign up for our upcoming events and also find links to our past recordings. And if that's too complicated, you can follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter. Now, while you're on that website, it would be just absolutely outstanding if you could also go to the far right button called Support. At the Support button, you can click the golden Give Now button, yet another one, and donate to our center. Every little thing helps. We're a public university. This has been a tough year. Thanks to everyone in the audience who has helped us in the past. And if you don't mind going there and looking whether maybe you can make a little contribution to our center, that would be just terrific. Thank you. All right, so the Japan Zoominar is a weekly event. And today, of course, we're going to talk about women in modern and current Japan. Let me just tell you what's coming up next. Next week, we'll talk about, believe it or not, a new era for Japan. That's about business and economy with Ken Shibusawa, followed by Esby Brown, who's an architect and artist. And he will review Japanese architecture and design for a better environment. He actually has a TED Talk on this thing as well. Very interesting guy. And then we'll have Dave Lahaney on the politics of everything, including the Olympics. Our Zoominars are recorded. I already told you that you can find the recordings at jfit.ucsd.edu. Because that's so, when you write during our event today a question into the Q&A box, I may read it out, but I won't refer to you to your last name. I'll only call on you by your first name to ensure your privacy. All right, so we have most of you in the room. So I want to get you started with a little quiz here while we're waiting for everybody to find their seats. And this is a quote from this week, June 2021. And I'll read it to you. And the question is, what country are we talking about? The quote is, I look at all the statistics. 70% of high school valedictorians are women. More than 50% of college graduates are women. Then I find that only 7% of CEOs are women, and only 2% of VC money is going to women. Talking about emerging markets, one of the biggest emerging market opportunities we have is women. What country is this quote about? I'll give you a hint. The quote is from Indra Nooyi. Another hint, Indra Nooyi for many years used to be the CEO of Pepsi Holdings, and has been for the last decade in the list of the top 100 most powerful women in the world. One of my idols, in fact. And she is talking about the United States. And I thought I'd just let you ponder that a little bit before we get too tough on maybe Japan. So let me find my stop share button here. My mouse is going somewhere. And introduce our speaker today. We have Alisa Freedman with us. Hi, Alisa. You're the best person to talk about this topic. So thank you for joining me. So let me introduce you to the crowd. Many of the people in the room know you, but some might not. So Alisa Freedman is professor of Japanese literature, cultural studies, and gender studies at the University of Oregon. She's also the editor-in-chief of the U.S. Japan Women's Journal. She earned her BA in Wesleyan University and her MA and PhD from the University of Chicago. And Alisa, I actually think of you as a sort of a Minzoku-gakusha in addition to everything else, so an anthropologist of the Japanese style. You've written a bunch of very interesting books, including Introducing Japanese Popular Culture, Tokyo in Transit, which is about people in the Tokyo commuting system, Modern Girls on the Go. That was a book with Chris Yano, who was on the show earlier on the Hello Kitty. The Secret Gang of Asakusa, which is an annotated translation of a Kawabata novel. And you've been a guest editor of 3 special issues and journals. You have many, many articles and papers. I would advise the audience to go to your website because you've listed many of your pieces there. So fantastic output, Alisa. It's great to have you here. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much. It's an honor.
So this is so interesting. Let's start, because we often have business people here and economists and political scientists. So let me ask you first. So you're a professor in humanities and in particular cultural and gender studies. So can you share with us what that means in terms of why it's important to study the topic of women in Japan through that lens? What do you see when you do that? What does that mean?
I love that question. That's such an excellent question. And thank you so much for the kind introduction. I prepared some PowerPoints and we'll have an open conversation and I hope everybody will join in. And I'm not an expert on everything or anything, and I'm happy to learn from everybody else. But to answer the question of why humanities, why gender, why cultural studies, I'm going to show some PowerPoints. And one thing I've learned during the pandemic, those of you who know me know that I have a bit of a PowerPoint addiction. I've been learning slowly through Zoom teaching especially. But in case you're interested, thank you so much for introducing my work. I don't know if I'm a good example or a bad example in being so interdisciplinary, but I'm very interested in, as I cross the disciplines, of looking at stories. And what drew me to the humanities is the stories that we tell. The stories we tell, like if someone asks you today, how's your day going? You're going to tell them a story, or the story that you write on social media, or the story that you research when you're looking at a woman's life from the 1950s, for example. So humanities, what I believe, I think in humanities, and I work with so many students in business school and in art and so many other fields and disciplines, but the humanities grounds us in what it means to be human. And women as being part of humankind. We could talk about different genders, but as our discussion today will unfold, women have had different experiences due to legal constraints, opportunities, and other things that tell us a lot about society and about the construction of gender. But I'm just going to illustrate with an example. One thing I've been thinking about the humanities, another reason, it gives me the chance to spread my wings and look at different kinds of stories. And one of my pet projects has been looking at how gender is told through people's memoirs, through historical accounts, stories by and about women, but also through things that we take for granted in our daily life. Like humanities is also a call, as I tell my students, to look at things. I don't do this now, but I have my students pull out their phones and look at emoji and look at what they see about women in the emoji universe. Like, for example, maybe you know that emoji were created in Japan in 1999, and they globalized on world cell phones around 2011. This means that people in Singapore are using the same emoji as the people in Switzerland and all across the world right now and they're vetted through the Unicode Consortium, but that's a topic for another talk. But before 2016, the only jobs that were available for women in the emoji universe were these, in addition to flamingo dancer. Do you know what this emoji is doing? This is not like the half shrug.
Is it the waitress or what is it?
This is actually the receptionist, and it was a gesture that was started in the 1920s by an identity I study called bus guides of women who worked on tour buses. Because as you know, like emoji also teach us about nonverbal gestures. In Japan, it's rude to point. You palm, you go here, go here, go here. So she's someone who works at a front desk of a department store in an office or a public place. Do you know what the other two with the ears are doing? Or I'll tell you, they're Playboy bunny dancers. But Same-sex emoji were finally added in 2012, same-sex families 2015. We now have a whole diversity of gender-free couples, different kinds of skin tones from 2015 and on. But it took until 2016 to have different diverse jobs for women in the emoji universe. So this is just one example of when you take a look at the different kinds of stories, you learn a lot about stereotypes and gender.
Wow, that's fantastic. So our topic today is women in modern and current Japan. And modern, of course, refers to a long time ago. How that happened is interesting, but okay, so modern and contemporary. And so and what you're doing in your work is you look at how stereotypes are both evolving, but also very sticky and persistent. So tell us a little bit about your insights there. Why are some of these images that we have of Japanese women so standardized and persistent?
You ask such amazing questions, and these are things that I've been thinking about. One, how I've been studying the stories of particular women who either mobilize stereotypes to do things within the system, or women who actively work to break down stereotypes. Why the persistence of stereotypes? That's a really important one, and someone will unpack later. One of people that's been getting under my skin lately is Marie Kondo, and I think she's the best at mobilizing stereotypes to build an empire. But for example, I'm going to share the screen again. I hope that if this is distracting to the audience, let me know this back and forth, the PowerPoints. I hope these images or image texts are helpful. But one project that I've been looking at, I've been studying, it's a little known fact that the largest group of exchange students from Japan in all of US history came to the United States in 1951. And among them, this in part was because there was a program, a cultural diplomacy program that was sponsored by the US Army, paid for by Japan's war debt, sponsored by the Garioa program. And under this program, there were 182 Japanese women who were sent for advanced studies at American graduate schools. Several had to repeat a couple years of study because under the old educational system in Japan, their university degrees in Japan were not the equivalent of then American BAs. But this is one example to me of how women were working through a system that placed them into a certain box, if you will. Like this was a program that was sending Japanese students, one who spoke fluent English. And to get into this program, they had to pass an English language test with highly ideological vocabulary words. Like I spent so many hours in the National Diet Library. I feel like I'm in violation of FERPA, like reading my research subjects' old test scores. But looking at like the questions on the test, asking ideological words, like everything from what is bread to looking at what's a state-funded land-grant university in the United States. But the purpose of this program was to send different genders to the United States who were highly educated and willing to acclimate to democracy. So these women went over, 182 of them. One, it was an opportunity. They were from all over Japan, including Hiroshima and Okinawa. And but one thing that wasn't told to them fully was they weren't supposed to earn an MA in 1 year. So there was a bit of confusion. Instead, they were supposed to be cultural ambassadors working within this program to learn about America, but yet to represent Japan. And I've been interviewing about 32 of these women. They're quite elderly, and I owe them a book. But they were sent all over. They were sent to places in the United States. Like if you notice from the map of placements from 1951, many of them were sent to the American Deep South, including to 2 women dressed in kimono here. And the Japanese women thought, okay, we're representing Japan. We should pack kimono in our suitcases. The men didn't do this as much. And the women sort of cheated. They had a kimono and they would cut it in half, like make a top and a skirt and use the obi as a belt to hold it together. Because those of you who wear kimono, you know it's really hard to put it on by yourself. And they would give talks at churches or public groups or Rotary groups or international nights and be sort of representatives answering questions about the war losses sometimes too. But these 2 women pictured here were sent to Louisiana, and they had very different experiences that they write about in their personal essays about how they were regarded as stereotypes of Japanese women. how they felt that they had to play certain roles. Or this is just a slide of some of the many books, like women use this educational opportunity to build their careers and become founding women in the field of Japanese studies, gender studies, psychology, anthropology, library science, and more. I'm going to skip ahead, but here is just another stereotype, getting back to that idea of kimono and how women worked within stereotypes. I've been studying images as part of my interdisciplinary work on this project. The picture to the left is an image from the orientation that these students went to. There were 10 different orientation centers for 6 weeks. And this was funded by the US State Department. And this one's at Bucknell University. And you notice I just circled some of the Japanese women wearing kimono. This is just at an event. They didn't dress a kimono every day.
Sorry, Alisa, why did the State Department organize this?
This is something I'm researching. One, because they felt the students were making a big mistake. When they sent these students over to the program, both men and women were studying too hard. And they were spending too much time in libraries, too much time in labs, and they wanted to teach the students that the main purpose was to learn about American-style democracy.
Was the purpose for the Japanese to learn that America is a great place, or was it also for Americans to revise their World War II image of Japan?
For mostly, to the best of my knowledge, for these American students to learn about, or to the Japanese students to learn about America. But hopefully it did lead to cross-cultural communication and knowledge. But the purpose was stated very one-dimensionally. Also, the orientation taught them how to converse in daily life English and how to take notes in classes, pragmatic information, how to be a student in the United States. But you notice, like the picture to the right, I've been talking with one of my personal heroes, Professor Marlene Mayo, and the history of this photograph with Eleanor Roosevelt was taken in August 1951 of the Japanese students visiting Eleanor Roosevelt for an open Q&A. But you notice this idea of women being dressed in kimono. Pictured, this is a close-up of Tomi Ayako, who narrated a propaganda film based on these orientations for the US military. So just one last bit about the stereotypes and just using kimono as an example of how women work within a system. I love this photo. This is from the Eugene, Oregon local newspaper from 1952. Showing 4 of these Japanese exchange students under the US military program. Those of you who've worn kimono know that that's not usually how you sit when you wear a kimono. You don't usually sit like this. I love their big toothy grins, and keep in mind the toothy grin, we'll get back to that. In this photo, they look so Americanized in their nonverbal gestures, their demeanors. And it just sort of shows, I like to think of these women too as being sort of cultural pollinizers, taking bits of Japan and America and putting them together in unexpected ways. And in the process, a lot of them started evaluating their own lives. What am I doing as a woman in Japan? Am I going to go back to Japan? And the jobs that these women did when they did return to Japan was working as a typist, because there was a need for clerical women who spoke English, who could type. Or translating dissertation abstracts for universities that still didn't accept that many women in Japan. And I threw in this photo of one of my research subjects to the right, just to show it went both ways. This is her omiai shashin, her arranged marriage photo of her dressed in American-style graduation garb from 1952. So I'll stop the share of this now.
So Ari wonders what happened to the lives of these alumni as when they went back to Japan. So did they become these secretaries, or did they? What is sort of the highest career path that you found, and what is the most traditional? I mean, did some of them just basically get married and go?
Excellent question. How this project started was thanks to my colleague, Yoko McLean. With Christine Yano, Laura Miller, and I were editing this volume called Modern Girls on the Go. Way back in 2010, we hosted a conference. And I invited my colleague, Yoko McLean, to join us because I had found that Yoko had come to University of Oregon in 1952. She was one class younger, and she had made her career here. And Yoko said, oh, no, I can't be in the book. I'm not a modern girl on the go. I'm an old gal receding. I'm like, no, you are most certainly not. But she joined the book and she contributed her personal essay. And then Yoko and I met every Friday for lunch, and we would pore over her photo albums, the menus she saved, things that she did. And Yoko did not plan to make her career in the United States. She met her husband when she was doing a part-time job on campus. And she was majoring in French, but she was hired as the University of Oregon's one of our first full-time Japanese language instructors, because there was a need for Japanese language instructors. And Yoko went on and published the book that if you studied Japanese in the 1990s, you might know, the Handbook of Modern Japanese Grammar.
Oh yeah, it's one of the best grammar books. Yeah, I have a really worn version of that. Yeah.
Her class notes from University of Oregon.
So Hiroki wonders whether how they were received in the US is more a question about the US or their impressions of the US, right? So in particular, he wonders whether Americans distinguish the Japanese from the Chinese and were global enough to understand the difference.
Excellent question. In fact, I wrote about that in chapter 1 of my book on Japan on American television, this conflation in 1950s television too of these Pan-Asian stereotypes, especially Japanese and Chinese, in very racist ways. But I think the Japanese women, for the best of my knowledge, it was known in their towns. They were often sent to places where they were the only Japanese nationals, not just women, but men too. So they were often called on, like I've been studying, and I talked about this in my AAS presentation. I keep it in plastic. This handbook that 16 Japanese students, both men and 8 women, wrote to future exchange students. The title's in English, but it's adorable. It's written in Japanese, but it's what you don't learn during orientation, like how to date, or what Americans smell like, or what to do when you're asked to give a lecture at a church group where they don't like Japanese people. Or they also discuss, and they don't use this term, but they discuss the racial landscape of 1950s America. And
those books were pretty common in those days, right? So the military actually issued a book on what an officer's wife has to behave like and things like that.
I love reading those books, and the recipe books too, because they're so full of stereotypes. But at the same time, it shows how people negotiate within that. So the Japanese students, some of them, because all of them have different temperaments too, they reacted in different ways, and they were sent to different places. Like some of them fared better that were sent to places that they felt more at home at, or they made close friends. Like I've talked with the daughter of one woman who was offered a second-year scholarship to go to Stanford University. And she turned it down because she said, if I can't stay at Central Missouri State with my friends, this program's not what I want to do. So they had different means. Some of them really used this grant and launched careers in Japan to founding women's studies programs in the 1970s. Some of them became very elite professors in the United States also. But one quick answer, once one of the women told me, she said her image of the United States, and she was studying at Wellesley College. She said there was a sign on the lawn saying, "Don't walk on the grass." But the students found that the easiest way in the winter was to cut across the grass in the snow to get to the cafeteria. So when she thought, okay, her idea in Japan is you follow the rules, you go around the sign and you take the route that's described to you, but the students were going right across the grass. So she said she woke up one morning and the university was constructing a path across the grass for the students to walk on. She said that was her image of 1950s America. If the students are going to walk on the grass, well, we'll find a way to incorporate it, was her view. So not that their views were always right, but they were always thinking of what it meant to be home or to be living between cultures.
So that's interesting. Right? So in the US, the university found the solution to accommodate the students' behavior. And in Japan, the students would just follow the rules. Right? So this brings me to the stereotype that, and it lives on, right? So let's go to the present. You have this fabulous paper on KonMari. So Marie Kondo, I think probably everybody on this show knows, but she's, so I was just looking at it from a business perspective. I just always thought that KonMari, which is just the first syllable of her last name and the first syllable of her first name, and then KonMari, also for me kind of, like this is the con artist. This is a really conniving move. Do you go into people's house, you say, hey, only keep 3 of the things that are most useful for you and throw the rest away, and then she has a store where you can buy tchotchkes because your house will feel too empty, right? Isn't that that is a great business model. I have to admire that. But she's also in some ways reinforcing some of these stereotypes, right?
I think she's a perfect example of a very savvy businesswoman who has mobilized the Yamato Nadeshiko, this idea of the ideal Japanese women. This is just my theory. And also at the same time, use Japanese stereotypes of what American women are like. I could show some images to answer this. Konmari lives in Los Angeles. And she just had a baby, a third child in April 2021. Marie Kondo, you may all recognize her. The picture to the right is her Netflix program. She's doing her signature move that she does, Pew! And this is the uplifting joy that comes from tidying up. She does make this sound effect. And she's often depicted, I intentionally tried to wear color today. She's depicted in her white cardigans. Because in Japanese business culture, you don't just wear a dress or a shirt, you cover up. And it would be awkward if she were to show up in a business suit in someone's house. So she wears a white cardigan, signature white, looks clean. She always covers her legs. She never wears jeans. But I believe she became the first celebrity anywhere to become a household name in the United States, first Japanese woman to become a household name in the United States by speaking Japanese on American television. And she first became famous through publishing best-selling books. I think here, her picture to the left are her books, and she seems to rewrite the same book. I mean, I'm not criticizing her for it, more power to her if she could build on it and stay within copyrights. I don't know if I would recommend it personally, but she started her book by entering a class for people on how to write a bestseller. And she made a pitch, and her pitch was accepted because the publishing company also felt that she could be a television celebrity, that there was potential here for cross-media promotion. And she was first promoted by Japanese television as early as 2015, 14. But if you notice on all of her products, her image appears, again, with the white cardigan, looking very neatly, dressed, smiling. Her smile changes on her different media. She moved to the United States in 2014 and lives in California. Her husband does not have her last name, and he's the CEO of KonMari Media. And they run a very savvy website. Thank you for mentioning that. It has videos on she has an American website and Japanese website, and they're both very different. The Japanese website's sponsored by the conglomerate Rakuten and sells things like hangers and other products. The American store sells a lot of tchotchkes about Zen Buddhism and also cleaning products, ties in with the Container Store and other ventures. But KonMari has this method that's based on a lot of common sense, like you fold things smallly when you put them in drawers, or you don't sort the garage one day, the kitchen the other. You sort according to things that you have attachment to. You sort clothing first because people theoretically in the age of fast fashion have a ton of clothing. You sort sentimental things last because we're more emotionally attached to it. So you cultivate a word that KonMari has trademarked called tokimekika, or this feeling of sparking joy, as the English translation goes. And she has trademarked the phrase spark joy too. You can't use this unless in this context without permission. But KonMari's also cultivated this presence of using stereotypes of Japanese homemakers. And she's aspirational in Japan also. I have plenty of friends in Japan who don't use the method. It's not that every Japanese person uses this or everybody's able to live like this. But she, just some images from her American website. She has a tutorial on how to make obento. And she also worked as at a Shinto shrine at age 18, but a lot of her method is premised on mindfulness and ideas of mindfulness, which comes from different theories, including Zen Buddhism. But she was made one of Time Magazine's Women of the Year and dressed in kimono at that part. But before her Netflix program, she had an NHK World series called Tidy Up with KonMari! And it set the format for her Netflix non-scripted straight-to-series show that aired in 2019, in which she visits California families and makes them better by teaching them to tidy up their home and thereby their lives. And when she enters their home, she does this sort of quiet ritual that becomes extended in the vocabulary of the show, that she's somehow this fairy godmother Zen creature that comes from another world to sit quietly through the American chaos. So what I argue in this, KonMari mobilizes these stereotypes also to show this juxtaposition of the so-called spiritual Japan, mythical Japan, and overt, overconfident, exuberant America. And I thank Jan Bardsley for helping me conceptualize my thoughts on this. But in KonMari's Japan Instagram, for example, she uses a very American style presentation. Like she shows public displays of affection with her husband. She holds up her book with pride. She includes her daughters a lot in her videos. So it's using also stereotypes in Japan of how American women behave, I believe. I'm gonna my long-winded answer to the question.
Well, it's great. So so this the Nadeshiko stereotype. So the world learned Nadeshiko after the soccer team had to fly economy class or something. But the soccer team was called Nadeshiko. But what is it actually? What is this Yamato Nadeshiko? How would you define it?
Yamato Nadeshiko is fascinating because I've been looking at how the identity is constructed in Japanese television too. It's supposedly a strong woman. Again, if anyone knows more about the stereotype than I do, please voice in. And Elise Edwards has done some amazing work on that soccer team of Yamato Nadeshiko also. But the Yamato Nadeshiko is a strong, quiet, demure woman who's a quiet force to be reckoned with. She's supposed to be modest, not overtly proud. The aesthetics of a Yamato Nadeshiko wears subdued colors. She often has bangs, like KonMari does. She wears very light makeup, light jewelry. She's not ostentatious, but yet this quiet power force full of a lot of knowledge that is able to use this. And this is brought up a lot, for example, in NHK, Japanese public television dramas, especially the morning television dramas that air around 8 o'clock in the morning to 8:15, that always feature a strong, quiet, powerful woman who lives between the eras, either contemporary Japan or the past, traversing decades often, that is someone who always works, does something unusual, but is not overtly exuberant, proud, loud, but someone who's more going along with the system and not intentionally overtly in your face breaking it all the time. And someone who exemplifies ideas of gambaru, this perseverance, too, as often comes to play.
Hence the soccer team's name. But the strong, quiet, that really is not helpful in the workplace.
Yeah. Good point.
I mean, so in order to get ahead in a large corporation of 100,000 people, you have to raise your hand. You have to say, "I'm going to take this job." You have to show off that you can do it. You have to, we all know this, and it's just needed. But in Japan, because of these stereotypes, you would be considered weird, kei yomenai, right? Because if you're too urusai and you're too noisy and you push yourself for the assignment, then people, the guys in the workplace will think of you as being particularly pushy.
Yeah, and I think women, all genders bear this burden, of course, and not all women are the same. Like one thing when I'm studying these women who were students in the United States in the 1950s, I'm learning so many different temperaments and how they negotiated their gendered identities in various ways. And some of them were coming to the US to escape constraints in Japan. But that's a really good point about women in the workforce historically being forced into, to give a pop culture example that I talk about with my students. I don't know if anyone has seen the animated series Agiretsuko, based on, she's a red panda, part of Sanrio. She's very kawaii, she's got a big head. She's very cute. She's a Sanrio character, one of Hello Kitty's distant cousins. But she's a working woman who wears the uniform of an OL or an office lady, particularly one that would have been worn in the quintessential blue of the 1990s uniform, who she suffers a lot of workplace harassment, and the men and other genders in the program also do, and they're all depicted as animals. But Agiretsuko's way of handling it is not saying, "I'm not going to take it anymore," to her boss or to herself, but instead she goes and sings death metal karaoke and lets out her emotions. So the program itself is not telling working women, hey, go change things. It's telling people, okay, you got to deal with this. We're going to provide you with some comforting culture so that you can cope. So one thing I find troubling about pop culture in general is that it stops short oftentimes of trying to initiate real change, but instead provides us with means to feel better about the constraints in which we're put in. And notably, when Agi Retzko goes and sings death metal about her problems, her voice becomes male, and it's voiced by the creator of the program. So I guess there has been some, and I maybe if other people know more about this than I do, I'd love to hear your research. But there have been some grassroots movements that have tried to change, for example, dress codes within the workplace, like the hashtag Kutu movement, especially of correct me if I'm wrong, but 2019, of women who are part-time workers sort of banding together online or through different formats, trying to change the idea of wearing high heels, both symbolically and real, because high heels are very uncomfortable. This idea that you have to wear a 1 inch and 3/4 heel as a norm if you're a woman in the workforce. You see this when you see students, for example, going up for shukatsu or the job search activities. So changing the dress codes that symbolically place people in their roles in the workplace, or how you're supposed to behave in these situations.
So I think let's stick, maybe if it's okay, let's stay in the sort of the large kaisha for a moment. I think there are two things that work against women in Japan that might not work against women in similar ways in other countries. And the first is that, of course, as everybody knows, historically, Japanese women, when they had children, they stayed home, and then they re-entered the workforce as part-timers, which meant that they were paid less and they had more menial jobs of like making copies and so forth. And because so many women were in part-timer jobs, an image was created that a woman is a part-timer and a woman makes menial jobs and makes tea, right? And so you almost have to be forgiving to the guys that have this immediate assumption. They see a woman, they think it's a part-timer because, you know, that's what it's been, which is a little bit different from other places. Not entirely, but a little bit. But then the second one is the stereotype of the Nadeshiko, who is this quiet, strong, and obedient, right? So obedient is a very important word in school as a grade. So for a girl, to be obedient is a really good grade. It's like an A in a US school. Whereas for boys, it's more like something else. It could be self-confident for all I know, and or a team player or something. So there are these stereotypes that run pretty deep, and they create these unconscious biases, of course, right? So women today have to work with this. So when they speak up, let me just cut this short. The whole women's movement will have to be rolled out in a very different way because these stereotypes are different. Is that fair? Or am I overstretching it?
No, you're absolutely, and I'm learning so much from you. Thank you. It's so interesting to watch Marie Kondo. I know that she's a television star and she's not a so-called ordinary woman. She's had resources that a lot of other women don't have, and access to things. And also she's mobilizing because she's petite, she's attractive, she doesn't yell at people. Like if she came into somebody's home and sort of started Gordon Ramsay style yelling at them, or Martha Stewart style, or other stereotypes of people on programs that are trying to improve themselves, we'd have a very different response to Marie Kondo. So it's very interesting to see how she works within the media structures of how women are supposed to look and behave. And she's been doing a series of videos in Japan, for example, sponsored by the Tokyo Metropolitan Government in 2020, about when you're stuck at home, you might as well tidy up, and some hints. And her speaking style is very demure. She speaks a very elegant Japanese, but she uses very strange combinations of words. She has her very own brand that way, and own phrasing that must be, I admire her translators so much. And she does have this, I'd love to study her translator. Her name is Ida Marie. By coincidence, they have the same first name. And Ida is often in the background taking notes. And even on the American Netflix program, KonMari, who has studied English, lives in Los Angeles, speaks Japanese. So already we have this kind of positioning. But that idea of conformity and behaviors and obedience, it's very interesting to see how this comes out in gestures and intonations and expectations of how someone imparts information. Like if Marie Kondo were to go on television and start screaming at people, maybe she wouldn't be successful. But one question I ask my students is, suppose she were Mark Kondo, a man. Would her behavior be different? Or she was Kondo Moresuke, for example, a Japanese man on this program. Would we have certain expectations for her that are different? Or there's all these news, not all of them, because it's still news when men in Japan take paternity leave. But there's been a few news bites and blips of elite men who are taking a few weeks off from work to help take care. I'm sure there's many more men in Japan who are playing roles as fathers, but the few high profile cases that are brought out as men taking paternity leave seem to rephrase discourses of parenthood in ways different than Marie Kondo having a baby, for example.
So Hidoki has a great footnote to this observation, saying that in Japan, at least according to his impression, very few people care about Zen. It's not a thing you talk about. It's a thing you may do or something, but the Zen is not talked about every day. But in the United States, Zen is like taken as this representative of some stereotype of Japan. And then KonMari goes and sells it as her image, right? And as the right approach to cleaning up your closet, which is really quite amazing. It's a feat. It's a marketing machine. So Keely wants us to go back briefly to the workplace and wonders whether this Nadeshiko stereotype, or this obedient, strong, quiet, but powerful woman image, does that work for Japanese men and women in the same way? Or the question is, do, say, Japanese men view it more positively? They like it, and Japanese women think that this is actually detrimental to progress in society?
Oh, that's an excellent question. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn to my humanities hat and answer again with more examples, but I'd like to think that culture shows us diversity too, and there's so many different kinds. And I'd like to think, like, one thing I always ask Japanese friends, or I try to observe when I'm in Japan, is how does change happen? Like change, I mean, I know I'm not trying to stereotype all of Japanese politics or all of Japanese business. And sometimes some years feel more eventful than others. Like 2020 just felt like the world happened in one year in many different ways. But I think that an answer to that question can also come out of different kinds of businesses and different, like there's been more and more women in creative industries in Japan that are doing alternative kinds of work and alternative kinds of life courses and behaviors, or people working within different work patterns, like with the breakdown of lifetime employment and other patterns of work that were quintessential, and you would know more about this than I do, for much of the 20th century has sort of opened up for different kinds of jobs, or women to work in various kinds of freelance. I'm not saying all of irregular work is right, and that's not the point, but people have pivoted in very interesting ways. And I'm finding, for example, there's certain industries that women have made inroads into, new industries, social media, self-help books. Not all people have been successful, and there have been plenty of hurdles. There's still a lot of economic disparities, last names, again, coming up in the news, other content controls, expectations. I remember when I studied Japanese language in the 1990s, we were told to raise our voices an octave higher for female, to speak like a little bit higher. I'm glad that doesn't happen now, but all the way that women have been coded. But I'm not sure how to answer the generational question. I hope that there are diversities of different kinds of genders that perceive women's roles differently. And one way that's made it happen is women have had the ability to have different roles within companies. It's been slow. And thanks so much for starting with that quote about the US, that the United States still lacks female CEOs. Like we still have stereotypes of American women, or we have stereotypes of American, like if you watch a Japanese television drama about a working woman, I've been studying images of career women in dramas over the years, and I noticed certain similarities. Like the women in 1990s dramas would always be the ones with the big shoulder pads on their suits and wearing the pantsuits. They'd be a little bit physically taller than the other women, a little bit older, and they would never, ever get the guy. And if they do, they would give up their job, but usually they would remain a working woman who would give advice to younger women who would end up marrying and pursuing marriage and motherhood as their life course. And we see this in my favorite drama, Tokyo Love Story, from 1991, which was rebooted last year. And even in the modern update, we still see these stereotypes persist to an extent.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I mean, the US is actually not much different. The stereotypes might differ in terms of what they express, but they're similarly strong, right? So one of the Japanese solutions to this, the Japanese women's solution to these stereotyping seems to be a particular pragmatism. So you mentioned the name change, and I recall meeting a Japanese politician. This is a while ago, but the story is still very powerful. She had been divorced and remarried 26 times, a number that would make Zaza Gabor envious, right? But obviously the same guy. So every time they had a baby, they needed a driver's license, they needed a new passport or something, they would get married for a day and do the admin stuff. And then she would get divorced, so they could go back to her maiden name because she had inherited her constituency from her father. So it was important that she could keep her father's name.
Wow.
This seemed to me to be a pragmatism at a level that I would have been unwilling to go through. Right, I would have tried to cut the walkway through the grass at the college rather than go following the rules and walking around. So this pragmatism, is this good or is it bad for a women's cause in Japan?
Excellent point. I've been reading too up on what do they call it? Paper divorces, like paper drivers and paper marriages. Like you get divorced on paper, then you remarry and you get divorced and you remarry. I don't think that's a solution. I hope that's not a solution. I mean, that's not a sustainable change in my view. I think the system needs to change personally. I mean, who am I to say, but it just seems these systemic issues that the systemic biases and like the Koseki system, what is it? The civil code, correct me if I'm wrong about the number 750, that make it by rule that a couple needs to take one last name, often the man's name. I don't know, like people like Marie Kondo, who built her media empire around her name. And she published her first book before she was married. So I guess that's a reason why she kept her name, because it's a brand. But I don't think that, I mean, it's interesting. Like you cut through the grass when you don't want to walk in like 20-degree weather to the cafeteria all the way around. But the university made it a solution. I hope that things are able to change. I've been interviewing one woman. This is an old story, but this is a nice coincidence that there was one of the women I've been interviewing. Her mother studied abroad in 1951 at the University of Michigan. And when I was talking with the family, the grandmother had a very interesting story of raising her daughter as a single mother through the pre-war period. And this was certain factors. She was registered in the Koseki, various ways. And I've looked at the Koseki and it's this interesting family relationship. But she became sort of like a kyoiku mama, like this educational mother that would push her daughter, saying the root is education. But one way that particular family was able to pragmatically take chances and make things possible was, one, the ingenuity of these powerful women to take matters and become seamstresses and make money to survive. And two, she was working within her Christian church and using resources that were available for education. So again, I don't know if pragmatics are a long-term sustainable solution, but I think they present fascinating stories and ways that we see how women and other genders have cracked the system.
And, you know, there's always this like 2 step forward, 1 step back. And I would be amiss if I didn't bring the word kawaii up. Kawaii. And also the way that girls speak, right? So it's kakoi and so forth. So and then of course the kawaii is a pop culture thing, but it's also a, you know, making girls cute, right? It's a cuteness that some of the characters might be boys, but it's usually associated with women, and it doesn't set this the whole course back. This celebration of kawaii.
I loved Cristiano's discussion about Hello Kitty and Hello Kitty fandoms in the Japan Zoominar series. If you haven't seen it, I'm going to go back and watch it again. It was really fascinating because Professor Yano, she delves into kawaii in so many different ways, aesthetically, what she calls pink globalization, how kawaii's become part of this Japan brand based on this umbrella term that circulated, especially between 2005 and 2014, of cool Japan, this globalization of content industries, mostly kawaii culture, that globalizes because it seems harmless and is not dangerous in overt ways. But kawaii, like, yeah, you're absolutely right. Like this aesthetic, you have like a big head, you have big eyes to show emotion, because emotion in a lot of Japanese popular cultures in the eyes. You have a small mouth. Hello Kitty is not lacking a mouth because she's a woman. It's because she's a blank palette and she takes on our emotions. But this use of, and Laura Miller, who is amazing, but Laura Miller delves in really well about what kawaii leaves out. Like when you globalize Hello Kitty or you globalize certain ideas of cute, it elides other forms of cute that might be more subversive. But getting back to that stereotype of kawaii that globalizes, it does seem very feminine, like this idea of agiretsuko, that red panda that represents working women, on now the Netflix anime series, or on plushies on bags, is apparently female, has female attributes, has a lot of neoteny, the big head, juvenile characteristics. But why does she need to sing male? Like it's interesting too that this small sort of facets that are commenting on gender. But kawaii also can be a mode of empowerment, I like to think. Like kawaii literally means I'm so cute, I'm going to make you want to take care of me. I'm going to make you want to love me because I am going to use my soft power instead of using overt, hard military might or economic sanctions or yelling at you. But I'm going to look so cute and so soft and so lovable that I'm going to control you. So I like to think in the back of my head that Hello Kitty's the most manipulative, she's not a cat, little girl character there is. But you're right that I think we really need to look hard at the gender subtext behind these aesthetics. And really, and this is something I encourage my students to do, even with emoji, with the characters around us, to look hard at why kawaii has these attributes, because we really learn a lot about the mythologies of gender underneath them and of nation.
So Catherine actually wonders on this point of pop culture, you mentioned how it often stops short of really daring change or doing something, but are there examples in Japanese pop culture or the authors where or designers or visual artists and star performers that actually have tried to contribute to change? And so she thinks of Aoshima Chiyo or Tabaimo, dance artists. So can you think of examples where what Americans think of, you know, pop culture and kawaii and so forth is actually a tool to bring about change?
I love that question. And the person who asked, like, please email me. I would love to collaborate with you on a project about this sometime, or to learn more about your research, or to give a shout out, please publish in the US Japan Women's Journal on your work on this. But I can think of some examples, but I mean, I can't give a concrete percentage, but most of the main pop culture franchises, the ones that have been the biggest money makers, have globalized the most smoothly, have been the ones that have presented subtle changes, but have ultimately held up underlying values like conformity, the family, ideas of gender. But you're right, there is pop culture that subverts. And there are, I think dance is an excellent example of form. And I don't know if dance is popular culture, and please persuade me that it is. I like to think, I mean, I dance all the time to keep myself sane, but I go to fitness dance, but ballet, other forms of dance, or Masafumi Monden has done some really excellent work about manga about ballerinas and how popular culture of ballerinas perpetuates certain notions of girlhood, not just in the tutus, but also in behaviors. But at the same time, Masafumi argues that they also subvert, or if they don't subvert, they show the fissures in the expectations of what it means to be a girl, and how that's difficult and ideal to achieve on one hand, and how that's undesirable on another hand in many, many ways. And I like to think too, one lesson that third and fourth wave feminists have taught us is the idea of intersectionality. And I like how popular culture is dealing not just with gender, but with also the intersection of different other variables that construct us, like where we live, how old we are, class, race, other factors, our own views of the world. And I can think of, especially when I look at Japan on American television, how there have been some really progressive changes in showing more diverse views of Japan than this awful yellow face stereotype, like these horrible old Gilligan Island episodes from 1964, where you have a white man doing buck teeth and speaking in poor slurs of R's and L's. One way that pop culture has taught us things is by showing diversity. But you're right. I think that there are popular culture, especially comedy, has been one example. I've been looking at in a short piece I did on the comedy duo, or comedy trio, I should say, with one main female star, Chiami Blossom with B, who became one of the most popular comedy routines in 2017 for doing a routine about a working woman who does this monologue. She has, I don't know if you've seen this, it's a comedy routine. Chiami Blossom has sort of a severe haircut. She wears like a severe version of a Japanese business attire. Became a parody in drag in Japan, and also the most popular Halloween costume of the year in 2017, around 2017, 18. But Chiami Blossom parodies this idea of a working woman in Japan saying, hey, I'm going to use my post-feminist working woman's ability to be an individual, use my feminine wiles. I hate that term. Please forgive that I just said that. But use the stereotype to get power. And she does sort of this, she's talking to working women saying, hey, why are you complaining about your boyfriend? Don't be like that. Men are like chewing gum. When you're done with one of them, spit it out and get another one, is her line. Or there's 20 billion men in the world. I'm not saying that comedy routine led to real change, but what I believe it led to, the fact that comedy routine exists in 2017 shows that there's more prevalent working women in Japan. The fact that people get the joke shows that there's more of them out there.
So one of my favorite recent, not so recent, 10 years ago maybe, TV shows was Hakken no Hinkaku.
I love that program.
So it was about Omae-san, who is a hakken because she wants to be a hakken, which means a dispatch worker, a temp worker. And then she goes home in the evening and dances a flamenco, and then she goes to Spain in the summer, and she can do everything. And she is a powerful temp worker. And she basically tells everybody how to behave, and she shows them how to do it. And she's like a whiz on Excel and whatnot. And so it created a completely different view of what a temp worker is. And so there are expressions like that, right? But the discrimination continues. Yuriko reminds us of not only 3 years ago the medical school admissions, but also the high school admissions. And not only, so we all remember, right? So boys were let in more, and in the medical school, it was because, don't you know, women don't become doctors, they have children, and then it's all wasted. And what Yuriko reminds us that 65% of doctors understands, quote unquote, why Tokyo why the university did this discrimination, right? And so there's also, of course, rising cases of power harassment, sekuhara, sexual harassment. Now there's also makahara, the mother maternity leave. So as a final question, as you talk to your friends and I guess, research subjects. But I think they're more friends and colleagues. What do you advise them when they, or what do you say when you hear these stories? I mean, what's your take on this? Is there something that an anthropologist, culture, gender specialist can say to these things? I mean, is there hope? Is there something they can do? Is there something you've learned from comparing the evolution of women in Japanese society?
I have learned so incredibly much, and thanks for asking that. And thank you for reminding about these persistent systemic discriminations that are a big part of the system. One thing that I'm battling with in my own work is I've been absorbing these stories, and I'm not an ethnographer. To do my project, I did research. I tried to teach myself how to do oral histories and how to do, even basic things like how to get IRBs and how to ask how questions instead of why questions. And I thank David Slater for guiding me on that. But when I'm with these women, I just thinking I'm absorbing their stories, and our interviews take place in various places, often at their homes. So we could pore over their photo albums and their books, and they often cook because that's hospitality. And I'm still regarded as a guest because I'm a foreigner coming in from outside, and that's a variable I need to take into account too. So I'm trying to figure out how to give voice to, and to borrow a term from Sumi A. Jones, these polyphonic voices. That not every voice, not every woman's the same. People are elite, people are not so elite. But a lot of the women I've been researching for my student project, for example, are very elite. And already their names are known, many of them. So who am I to tell their story? So what I like to think is I'm experimenting with ways of, I've been reading a lot of creative nonfiction, for example, how to be faithful to the stories I'm hearing, but not speak for the women. That's not the point. How to make an academic argument. One lesson that a lot of the women ask me too, they're very curious, and I had this on a slide, I could bring it back. One of my research subjects was I met her at her house. This is a follow-up, like our third interview. And she was so proud. She pulled out this piece of paper and she wanted to show me. It was the alumni newsletter for the Aoyama Gakuin Junior College that she had worked at as a librarian. And she wanted to show me that because I am writing about her, she wrote an article about me. And it's hilarious when you look at the visualization of the page, because it's Japanese, and it has the word Alisa-san, Japanese, Alisa-san in alphabet. Oh, because she didn't want to write my name in, she just wrote me as Alisa-san because that's ways of getting around formalities and other things. But the stories go back and forth that way. And if my project, if it's successful or not, one way I'm hoping is that it opens a larger conversation. I hope, like I went out for lunch in July 2019 with a grandmother and a granddaughter, because the granddaughter wanted to interview her grandmother to hear her grandmother's story. So I'm hoping one thing, if my work could do anything, is to get the conversation started.
That's great. And it's a great way to close the Japan Zoominar today. I could go on for hours. The audience is not leaving. You have us, you have us on the edge of our seats, but unfortunately time is up, and I want to be respectful to everybody's day as it is continuing. So let's close it up here. Alisa, it was fantastic, and I would love to have you back in a while. I'm sure there's more to talk about, right? You're a fan of Sesame Street, and so how Japan is actually depicted in places like Sesame Street would be very interesting topic. So let's have you back at some point in the future. Thank you for joining us today. It was a fantastic conversation, and you really changed the way I think about some of these questions. So thank you very much. Thank you. Audience, she does have a paper on KonMari, so if you'd like to read it, I'm sure she'll be happy to share it. So thank you. Professor Alisa Friedman, and everybody join us next week with Ken Shibusawa. Believe it or not, Japan is changing. So we'll talk about that. I'll see you in a week. Until then, stay well, stay healthy, and take good care. Goodbye.